Thank you very much, Shagufta. Good morning, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to everyone here at the IBA. As the Vice Chancellor of the university, I'm often asked to open every single event at the IBA, from computer science to mathematics, of which I know very little, to business studies, which I've sadly had to learn. And sometimes it's an exciting theme called challenging linearity. This is the third international conference of the School of Economics and Social Sciences and the Center for Business and Economic Research, CBER. And every time I've come and opened the conference, it's been a great pleasure. This time, I must add that it has been my surprise, very pleasant surprise, and a thrill in some ways, to open a conference which is called Challenging Linearity. I think I'm not sure, I've asked Asma Haider, my dean, who came up with this title, and she still hasn't told me. And I hope that she will let me know who came up with this title of Challenging Linearity. Every other conference we go to is pathways of development, development frameworks, development futures, things of that nature. And this is in whether we go to PIDE, whether we go to LUMS, whether we go to any other university in Pakistan, it's always the same. You know, which is the best path for development, and which is the framework for development, and what is the macroeconomic framework for development. It's often that it's very seldom that we think about notions such as linearity. And I'm a social scientist. I used to be an economist, but fortunately I gave that up. And now I do other things like history and things like that. So for us, this notion of linearity is very central and very critical to how we think about the life, the past, the present, and the future. And what it means for people, for individuals, for countries, for nations, for a university, and for education as well. So when I think of challenging linearity, I'm sure there are numerous ways to challenge linearity. We have anthropologists, sociologists, feminists, and economists, and others, and policy people who are going to question this theme. But there are two ways that I sort of think about linearity, and I must admit and sort of confess that until the title was presented to me, I may have thought about it, but since this title has been presented, I've thought a little bit more about it. So there are two ways I would think about challenging linearity. One is this notion of what we economists, and there are many here, call path dependence, and something that we've learned. And I used to be a historical materialist, also known as a Marxist in the older language. So for us, path dependence was very important. We are what we are because of how society, groups, institutions have evolved and how they continue to evolve. And the future is often, used to be at least in theory, in places where knowledge production takes place, used to be based on patterns of linearity, some way of looking at it, of what the past presented, and perhaps an element of prediction, or at least expectations of what the past presented. One could call that path dependence, one could call that linearity. I'm sure there are people in the audience who will challenge this very simplistic notion of that. But the more we think about the current state of affairs of our country, of the world, of climate change, the absence of climate change, the absence of recognition of climate change, we are struck by the fact that this notion of linearity, of a path dependence, is not linear. I mean, of course, I think the past matters. As a historian, what else can I say? I would be unemployed if I said the past doesn't matter. The past does matter very substantially, very deeply. But the fact that we can make predictions on the past is something that I think we need to rethink. And I think historians have done that. They don't talk, this cliche that I used to hear when I was growing up, that learn from the past. I don't think it matters anymore. I don't think we can learn from the past. I think we recognize the past, we know what happened in the past, but what happened in the past may not affect what is happening today or what's going to happen in the future. So I think this one way of questioning linearity or challenging linearity is to think about whether the past allows us to think about the future. And how does it allow us to think about the future? It's not a unilinear path. It's a spiral. It's a stairway. It's a staircase. It's a flow. It's different. It goes into different streams. So I think that's one of the ways I've thought about thinking about linearity, and thinking about how, as a social scientist, my own work and that of my colleagues and others, my students, needs to be rethought. What does one mean by linearity? Where does one draw the line between the past, the present, and the future? And what does one learn from that? The second area where I've thought about linearity is this notion of learning from other countries. Again, I don't want to learn from other countries. Of course, I want to learn from other countries, but I don't think that they provide a blueprint of what we call developmental pathways, or the path for the future. We're often told that Malaysia did this, Turkey did this, other countries did that, India is doing this. Why can't we do that? I think that there's a lot to learn as academics, as scholars, from countries all over the world, developed, underdeveloped, south, north, totalitarian, democratic, and other countries. But I think that what one would call pathways of development or thinking about prospects for the future, I think it's often how institutions themselves in particular countries, context, individuals, roles, and of course, the linearity of the past, the historical precedents matters. So sometimes when we say that if Malaysia did this, or if Japan did this, why can't Pakistan do this? Because this is not Pakistan, this is not Japan in the 21st century, this is not Malaysia after 1980 and 1970, and perhaps we don't want to be Malaysia. I think there are things that we can learn from other countries, but this question of copying other countries and saying that because it happens in one country, it ought to happen in, say, Pakistan, I think is something that we need to question. So and I'm sure there are many other ways of thinking about linearity as well. So I'm just going to welcome you guys again and thank the World Bank, UNICEF, Sindh Higher Education Commission, the GIZ, and particularly my two colleagues, Asma Haider, the Dean of the School of Economics and Social Science, and Dr. Junaid Memon, the Director of the Center for Business and Economics Research, and their colleagues in the School of Economic and Social Sciences, for arranging this conference, the third one that we have. And I hope it's going to be exciting, challenging, not just linearity, but challenging each other's ideas. I have to end at one note, which every opportunity that I get, there's no way of avoiding what's happening in the world today. I think there's a genocide taking place in Israel, in Palestine, and it's not possible to see two sides. I can't see two sides. 11,312 people massacred in 5 weeks, out of which 3,000 may have been children. And there is no level playing field of any sort. A ceasefire is the least aspect of civilization. Sadly, the United States and Canada have vetoed United Nations resolution for a ceasefire. When we talk about linearity and challenging linearity, for the last 76 years, one particular pattern of colonial settler colonialism has taken place in the Middle East, especially in Palestine. And I don't see much change there. Of course, there's been dynamics and change. And I also think one particular Muslim country is complicit in what has happened and has a major role to play in ending this violence, this genocide, this extermination of Muslim children and people and civilians, and it refuses to play that role. I think it's important for us as Pakistanis, as civilians, as citizens, as human beings, to point that contradiction out, that on the one hand we have an organization called the Organization of Islamic Countries, I think perhaps the least useful international organization that I'm familiar with. We have very powerful countries there who represent supposedly the Muslim world, who refuse to stand up and fight against the colonialism and imperialism that takes place, which is backed by large powers in the world. So I'll end there and hope that perhaps somebody will also talk about Palestine. We can talk about inequality, but Palestine reigns over our minds, over our televisions, over our screens, in whatever form we want, and look at it. We can't avoid it. So there are certain truths that, whether we like them or not, we need to think about them. We need to confront them. And perhaps as citizens, need to come up with ideas of how we want a very different world from the past that we've inherited. Whether it's climate change, whether it's Pakistan's terrible democratic electoral politics, or whether it's the future of Palestine. Thank you very much.